When I look at the all hazards map in the morning, sometimes it's like really busy and pretty and colorful, and you can kind of immediately tell there's like a winter storm moving through one side of the country or the other. And sometimes there's not much going on. It can be a little bit boring. But this one here this morning, it isn't like you're not going to find a more NOAA all hazards map looking at all the different watches, warnings, and advisories that's like more obvious with respect to what is happening in the atmosphere, where the jet stream's coming out of, what weather systems are moving across the country. And this one just lines it up for us. We start way in the northwest, Washington. Look at all the green colors there. You got flood warnings, flood advisories, flood watches. Not only do the flood watches in that dark green color tell us that more rain is coming, and which it's falling here this morning, but the advisories, the hydrological outlook, you can see that one at the bottom. The warnings tell us a lot of rain's already on the ground and is starting to get into these rivers here and causing big issues. So you can just see that, big time water issues here. Then you get into like the beige mustard colors. So those are the high wind warnings and the wind advisories telling us that high winds moving through the Palouse over towards Spokane, and then the high wind warnings through Wyoming, like near Cheyenne, Laramie, down in through the Front Range. Definitely have some strong winds moving through here and here over Montana. And then mostly, look at this winter weather advisory streak, if you will, all the way across the central part of the country, kind of culminating in a blizzard warning, that orange color there, and the Appalachians near like West Virginia, far west Maryland. And so there's your Clipper track, low right along that winter weather advisory track. We're expecting a swath of like 2 to 5 inches of snowfall anywhere in between here. And you can just tell our jet stream's cranking in here and diving down into the middle part of the country. Maybe something, so we can move that out of the way, pull up that marker again. It's not hard to tell the jet stream's ripping through here, causing a low to spin up. That's helping the pressure gradient force rip the winds from the interior down the slopes of the higher elevation here across the Front Range and the Continental Divide here. And then ultimately, we can tell the flow's coming down here in some fashion. One, you're not going to get a blizzard without cold air, even in the Appalachians. And look down here, the freeze warnings in some of the citrus area here. Southeast Georgia, northeastern Florida, getting close to Jacksonville with freeze warnings and a frost advisory there. Over in the Great Lakes, you got your winter storm warnings and lake effect snow warning there in that kind of turquoise color. And again, just indicative of this trough that's set up here, and some wind advisories for Massachusetts. So the pattern is here, and it's been one that we've been stuck in for a while, and you're going to see it in the 7-day forecast. We have to get out to like the 20th. Eric mentioned this yesterday, so we start seeing that change in that like mid-December holiday pattern that I think is coming. It's kind of throwing a wrench into the January forecast a little bit, to be fair. If we look at the surface winds here this morning, I've zoomed in on the American Northwest here just to highlight those corridors of very strong winds. The Front Range is like right about here in Colorado, and you can see the very strong winds coming off of those in both Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado here this morning. Those will be lightening up a bit as we go through the day and then into tomorrow, but I'm going to jump over to see if I have... Yeah, we'll start here. Here's the maximum temperature here today on Thursday. Always neat to see. Look at the Thule fog. It's settled into the Central Valley. Sounding like a broken record. I mention it every day here this morning. Pull up. First, man, look at the plains. Getting up into temperature with a 7 in front of it over Kansas. Mid to high 60s, central Nebraska along the Platte River there. And an interesting temperature gradient I'm going to focus on a second here. But I do want to jump over and see that Thule fog. It's night right now. But even if you look at the infrared satellite, there's that jet stream that we talked about diving down into that trough. It's hard to tell that that's fog. You can kind of see it looks kind of gray, but one kind of cool feature, you can go down here and click on nighttime microphysics, which tries to pick on some of these like nighttime clouds. And you can see the low clouds over the Midwest. And you can see that fog there and that kind of milky color there standing out from what the ground looks like around it. So that tells us that that is in fact fog. We're not getting all the way down to the ground. That fog stretching all the way over the San Francisco metro area, and some of it maybe sneaking up into the Willamette Valley there. So kind of a neat product. If you come down here, you can see what's going on in the lower levels on that infrared overnight. Another thing I wanted to mention, if we look at the river levels in the state of Washington, particularly on the slopes of the Cascades, the windward side, many of these reaching toward major flood stage. That is in a lot of the forecasts for the ones that haven't already reached it. If I go to like Snoqualmie Falls in Washington, that one forecasted to reach near record. And if you click on a lot of these, the forecast over the next 24 hours has a lot of these rivers reaching near their record stage. And you got to imagine that over the course of these observational histories that, the state of Washington has seen extremely impressive rainfall events. So the fact that they're getting close to record at some of these locations tells you just how much rain has fallen. A little bit further south toward Oregon, you're talking about moderate flood stage, not quite as excessive as some of these ones going up toward major, but by and large, plenty of rainfall coming through these areas. The flooding has been mostly reserved for kind of near the rivers for now. That's where a lot of these flood warnings are. It's kind of hard to see those in the background there, but they are on there. I want to jump back over to Nebraska for a second. I talked about those high temperatures moving into the Central Plains. Western Kansas, like Goodland, up into the 70s. Central Nebraska up into the mid to high 60s. Look at the 68s along the Platte River here. Go from like Grand Island, which is right in here in central Nebraska. You can actually get to Sioux City here in about like 3 or 4 hours, maybe even less, depending on the wind. But if you look, that gradient, 3-hour drive, and you drop more than 30 degrees temperature, almost 40, right, between the two here today for high temperatures. So cold day, below freezing, northeast of this line, and you travel west across that temperature gradient, and you get into a pretty pleasant day across the Central Plains. Interesting temperature gradient. And this is indicative of that pattern, right? There's your temperature gradient. The jet stream aloft is going to flow typically right along that. And so it's not really a surprise to show you this, the maximum temperature here today, and go back and show you, well, along that temperature gradient, we have jet stream flow. That tends to help induce these low pressure systems which run along it. And I didn't show the jet stream flow, but if I go back and tell you where that jet stream's setting up, it's right along that temperature gradient that we saw. Cool north of the jet, warm to the southwest of it. And we're seeing that just kind of the microcosm of it in Nebraska here today. I want to show the minimum temperatures here in the forecast because with that cold air coming down out of Canada, big time difference today in the minimum temperatures. Waking up here this morning in the 50s in portions of Montana where it's windy with that downsloping wind, that Chinook effect. But tomorrow, Thursday, cold front comes through, 50 plus degree temperature swing down to -8 near Glasgow. And that is an impressive swing in 24 hours for the minimum temperatures tomorrow morning, down into the negatives for North Dakota. And then Saturday, this spills further out into the Midwest. Much colder day for many areas here, especially Minnesota and Wisconsin. But boy, by Sunday, that's the big ticket day with respect to the Arctic air that bleeds in here. -24 near Fargo. Twin Cities down near -20. I mean, excessively below freezing in some of these areas here. Central Illinois and Indiana below freezing, or I should say below zero. And just a very cold day on Sunday. I will say the last Arctic air outbreak that we had, we didn't quite reach the depths of the cold air that was forecasted both by this model and some of the other model temperatures. We sometimes struggle with these really cold air events to figure out how far down we're actually going to get. So curious to see if we actually make it down to -10, -19 in northwest Iowa, but kind of semantics here, whether we reach -10 or -15. It's going to be very, very cold in a lot of these areas as we go through the weekend. That continues a bit on Monday through the Midwest, Eastern Corn Belt before we start to warm up on the backside. That cold air reserved more so for the East Coast by the middle of next week. And that pre-Christmas warm-up is on across the West. Those temperatures warming up quickly. We'll have to see how the snow melts. These are overnight lows, so you can imagine the daytime highs coming up about 20 degrees more than that as we go into the next week. Eric showed yesterday that it's been a cold start to winter, especially like the end of November, the beginning of December here. And with this kind of cold shut coming in, I'm just kind of curious how natural gas prices are moving around with this. Now, these are impacted by trade and public policy and other things happening, even military at times like we saw with the Ukraine-Russian conflict. But they have been going up as we've approached this winter, especially into late November. And this graph is showing you over the last year of those natural gas prices rising here this winter. But if you look over the last 5 years, those have been climbing ever since that war started. They fell after that kind of initial outbreak and have been climbing since then. And with the cold winter that we've started with, they've risen likely as a result of that. Of course, there's other factors kind of going on in here, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of the major factors here. A little bit of a drop here recently with probably the warm, late December temperatures that we might be seeing coming in here. Always kind of neat to connect some of those dots there. Jump over and look at radar this morning. You can see some of that snow, mixed precipitation along that jet stream flow, that low clipper track, if you will, coming down near Glasgow here. If you look and see those bright colors, we talked about this, I think last week. That tells us that this is snow falling into above freezing temperatures, likely near the surface, near the radar. That's right about there. And that snow's starting to melt, and so it becomes kind of a flake wrapped in this exterior coating of water, and that becomes very reflective to the radar. So it shows up almost like a thunderstorm. We call that the melt layer there. And if we look, I didn't pull up surface obs next, but it is about 35, 36 at the ground there. So mixed precipitation, that's what that tells us falling there. And that's going to be the case until some of this colder air moves in and transitions this over to snow. But I'll look at that forecast for that clipper track here this morning. Let's make it valid. I'm recording this about 6 a.m. Central. And sure enough, that melt layer right there, right where we picked up on that bright line over the radar there. So snow to the northwest of that, mixed precip to the southeast, that heavy rain falling here this morning that we saw over in the Pacific Northwest, bringing those rivers up to their near record levels in portions of Washington. If I play this forecast forward through the morning, see the snow spreading east, north of Sioux Falls, southwest Minnesota into Iowa. Rain further south across Montana, but that snow spreading in this evening across Iowa, into Illinois, into Indiana, even Kentucky here, overnight tonight on Thursday. Pushing more snow to the eastern Corn Belt. Again, a quick shot of like 1 to 3 inches in this quarter here. Some areas might get up to like 2 to 4. That pushes over into the Appalachians by Friday morning, and then we have a weak system moving through Minnesota here with some light snow into Wisconsin. And then round 2, another one of these clipper systems coming off the Front Range in Montana. They've seen plenty of snow and cold air to start the year. It's going to be very cold this time. Remember, we were looking, that was when those temperatures were really diving down into the Midwest at this point. Very cold in this corridor. Very light, fluffy snow moving through. It kind of gets blown around, kind of sparkles. And by Saturday, this moving over the Midwest, Nebraska, Sioux Falls, Iowa, into Illinois. Saturday evening, now spreading across, the central Corn Belt proper here, maybe focus more so on that I-80 corridor, and that's going to continue moving east, but we've reached the end of the 3-kilometer NAM forecast. If I just show you the 7-day snowfall, I'm going to pull this back. That's the 10-day. With those 2 systems coming through, you can see that clipper corridor here, anywhere from like 2 to 4, get up closer to like 5 or 6 near the Appalachians, maybe a little bit over 4 here in Illinois, but certainly over that in Montana. But generally, let's say 2 to 5 along this strip here. Not much outside of it. That light system moving through Wisconsin, Minnesota, and to the southwest, that's where we're warm. We looked at Grand Island and west, toward like Goodland, Garden City, Kansas, too warm for snowfall, and that line stays to the north. If we look above at that jet stream level pattern, we looked at this just a second ago. This has been the familiar playbook. We've been talking about this, that trough moving through, bringing those cold temperatures down into Florida, but I'm actually not looking too closely at this here this morning. It's actually not what caught my eye initially. I pulled this up this morning and went, hey, what is going on over here up near the Aleutians in Alaska? And if we kind of pull ourselves out a little bit, blow this up, this is starting to look, to my eye, a little bit blocked. And what I mean by that is you have a ridge here over Alaska, you have a trough underneath it, and another trough paired here. We call this an omega block because it looks like the Greek letter omega. And if you've watched these videos throughout this year, we've seen maybe like 1 to 2 of these omega blocks already this year. And when these set up, particularly over here, they tend to be sticky. So they stick around in this pattern. That's why we call them blocks. They kind of block up the atmosphere. When this occurs, and then if this kind of entrenches itself here, it tends to produce a trough downstream of it. You get kind of a little trough here, you get a big ridge here, and necessarily you kind of get this trough downstream of it. Now, we're not quite seeing that yet. In fact, we have a ridge here over California. But as we look out into the forecast, this block does stay around, and we start to see something of a trough settle in just downstream of it. That's going to be very relevant to that Christmas forecast that I'm going to show you in just a second here. We can see this on the jet stream level forecast from the ECMWF model. Let's play this out through. I'm going to take it into like very early tomorrow morning, and there's that omega block. You can see it kind of stretched out vertically. Trough downstream of it, kind of have a ridging here initially over California. As I play this forecast forward, we start to push that ridging over the continental US out into next week. Little system moving through the Midwest on Monday. That ridge starts to break down a bit. There's that block still here. We even have this little low beneath it, starting to increase those jet stream level winds over Oregon and Washington. Play this out into Wednesday. Now we have something of a trough settling in. There's that Pacific Ridge. It's still sitting there. You get a trough downstream of it. Plenty of flow and moisture into the northwest, even starting to get into California, improving their precipitation chances. It's hard to see this jet stream flow kind of moving west-east across the country, but there's actually this little divot and the shortwave trough, as we call it, moving through here. And that is going to bring some inclement weather to the Midwest next week as that pushes through. But we keep this general ridge and trough pattern here over the west, and that's bringing good flow into the Pacific Northwest and portions of California. And it's helping because we have a trough here. What goes down in the atmosphere often comes up. We have a ridge now building in next weekend over the middle part of the country in this corridor here. If I play this a little bit further, now you start to see this trough tracking a little bit more to the east. We still have the ridge over the Aleutians, trough over the eastern Pacific, if not the American Northwest, and then this ridge downstream of it bringing a warm kind of pre-Christmas stretch to this corridor here, and better flow over California. It's not coming in like this anymore at the beginning of the forecast. If I played this all the way back, up here over the Pacific Northwest, play this forecast all the way forward, and better flow coming in to the state of California. I'm going to take this forecast out a little bit further near the end of this video. Just to my eye, I would expect if we see this come to fruition, we're like 10 days out at this point, that this trough would continue to march east in this pattern. This trough would likely amplify, and we'd get into that better flow pattern that Eric kind of hinted at yesterday. That wouldn't surprise me, just kind of given that we have a little bit more momentum in the atmosphere kind of with this configuration as that block starts to break down in the long range. Whether that will happen or not, we'll have to wait and see, but it just kind of looks to my eye like that could be the case, which would be better for precipitation, I think, across the Rockies, kind of the Western Plains, even California. All right, if we play that forecast forward, we're going to see that first clipper, that weak system that we already talked about. We already kind of walked through this on the NAM, and it looks pretty similar in the ECMWF. There's that second system that cuts through the Midwest here, bringing that extra shot of light snowfall, very likely fluffy, not too hard to shovel. We get a break for the Pacific Northwest and a lot of the areas of the continental U.S., even the Canadian Prairie here with respect to precip through Sunday as that cold air dives in. There's this high associated with that kind of over Kentucky. And then the rain is back on as that flow starts to inch south across the west coast. Monday, Tuesday, mentioned that fast-moving system coming across early in the week. And then a better system now. This was that one that was kind of hard to see, but that little divot, that shortwave trough moving across the Midwest Wednesday and Thursday. But by this time Thursday, next week, we have flow moving into California. Better precip coming in through here, western Wyoming, through Idaho. There's this low moving through the Midwest now. Snow lined further to the north with that warm air building in on the back side of it. So now one of these big, deep Midwest winter storms, kind of a weaker one with more rain coming on the southern side of it through much of the Corn Belt there. Playing this through Thursday into Friday next week. Another system kicking out more so on the northern edge of the country here, but look at Central California now getting in on some rainfall, the Sacramento Valley, much of Oregon, and then finally the snow levels dropping enough to get decent snow into the Cascades and the northern Sierras here. Those snow levels have been very high to start out the year out there. And this model bringing that precip all the way through into the San Joaquin Valley with at least some snowfall coming into the Sierras. Now the forecast ends there. We can see something of a low starting to start out again in the eastern part of the country near next weekend. Snow way on the back side of it. But again, with this low here, that trough coming in like this would not surprise me if this just continues to march throughout that Christmas week further to the east, bringing precip here. It's way too early to talk specifics on that. We're 2 weeks out at this point. But just to my eye, if the first 9 days of this forecast come to fruition, that would be the likely scenario for the 10 to 15 day time period. Pulling up the ECMWF versus GFS, frankly, I don't see a lot of differences between the two. I will pull up mid next week, like Wednesday. We were kind of hopeful we'd get something of a coastal low tracking through the southeast given their lack of precip recently. Similar precip for the northwest. Similarly have that low kind of up in Ontario, but the GFS a little bit more bullish for rainfall for Texas. The weak system there, the ECMWF has this system here along. The GFS is a little bit further back with it, but generally kind of a similar precipitation configuration there. The GFS snow line is further to the north for folks like in Michigan, more populated areas of Canada here. But that's the only major difference I can really find between the two, even out to next Friday to the 19th. Some kind of subtle differences there between how this next wave comes into the west, but not a huge pattern difference, at least initially. And they even both have the same low kind of settling up next Saturday as it moves through the Midwest. GFS a little bit stronger with that one, but given we're 10 days out, it's kind of impressive agreement right now this winter. If we look at the 10-day precipitation departures from the ECMWF, you can see that rain line in the northwest moving further to the south. So now getting in to California, we can see those clipper systems. That light fluffy snow does not bring a lot of total measurable precip. Once you melt it down, it has that high snow to liquid ratio, and you're seeing that there despite it moving through this corridor, bringing a decent amount of snow here. Still ends up below average for this quarter. A lot of the flow is still moving across the northern part of the country, and that coastal low kind of evaporating on the models, given that that weaker low next week tracked through this area, not along the coast. The GFS was a little bit wetter in Texas, however. And sum this up too just by looking at the ECMWF ensemble. This is the probability of just reaching an inch or more, which isn't too hard in winter. And you can see Central California finally getting in on some of this rainfall, some of that falling of snow in the higher elevations. Much of the northwest looking at an inch plus. Eastern Corn Belt with those kind of weak lows moving through that we looked at next week, over into like Ontario and Quebec, looking at better precipitation chances. But unfortunately, the Southeast, the Carolinas, below 50% chance, if not almost down to zero, that we're reaching an inch or more all the way out 10 days, 10 plus days into the forecast. We're all the way out of 15 days at this point. So a lack of precipitation coming for these areas here all the way through the holidays. This one is one that we've brought up time and again. If we look at the drought change map over the last 8 weeks, where has the drought been building? Where has the classifications been removed? Well, this has been the trend. Less rain here and more to the north. And we actually kind of see that trend in the forecast. That's why I always look at these drought trends. They sometimes beckon toward what's going to happen in the future. And so kind of not a shocker to see what was resolved as that low moving through this area in the forecast earlier this week for next week. That low's been moving more so to the north, if not even like the upper Midwest. And got to watch some of the areas here on the plains shifting over drier as well. Obviously, if you look at the 8-week change map, that includes some record-breaking rainfall in California, even portions of Arizona in October and November, but they've actually shifted over dry here, obviously, over the last 2 or 3 weeks. I'm showing the 8-week change map, not like the 2 to 3 week change map, but starting to watch this area for concern with snowpack. But again, I think chances are improving here later in the period. Look at the upper Colorado River region, kind of the snowpack over the Rockies, even getting into like Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, etc. We're starting the year below average. We have plenty of time to make up for it. It's our busiest time of the year. If you look when the slope is increasing the fastest, it's really like late January into late February. And so plenty of time to get back to average on this graph for the Colorado Basin snowpack, but we're starting kind of on the wrong side of that graphic there. Speaking of the wrong side, if you go over and look at the California, same one, we are meeting the bottom of this graph. So near record lows to start out the year in terms of California snowpack. But again, it only would take maybe 1 to 2 weeks of an improved pattern to get us back up to average. So too early to kind of cause any sort of alarm here as far as the California or Colorado snowpacks, but at least to start, we're not trending in the right direction. This is likely to improve in that 2-week forecast. And here's the best example of this. Little irresponsibly took the ECMWF AIFS forecast all the way out to the end of the period. And it's actually on Thursday, Christmas Day, December 25th, 15-day forecast that I'm just showing you blankly here, which again, not the most responsible forecast as a meteorologist, but it does show that one of these scenarios that plays along well with what we talked about with this deep troughing here over California. This would bring rain all the way likely through San Diego, plenty of snow with lower snow levels for the Sierra Nevadas. This is one operational run, but shows a scenario that's possible as we go through Christmas week. And look at the eastern U.S. I mean, this is like a torch bringing that warm air up into the middle part of the country. You're talking widespread 50s all the way up to like maybe I-80 on Christmas Day if this were to come to fruition. Now, I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. I mentioned a little bit silly showing a model run this right at this time, but generally there's better support for troughing here and ridging here, which likely means warmer than average for Christmas week here, and probably better precipitation chances here, the details of which we'll iron out. But there's that Pacific Ridge that's starting to show up now. Looked at that in the forecast, lasting all the way 15 days. Good example of what a blocked up pattern looks like. And we can see that from the ECMWF ensemble on Christmas Eve. Ridge over trough, blocked, trough downstream of it, ridge downstream of that. Better precipitation here for some areas that have lacked it early in the year. Colder, lower snow levels for folks looking for more snow there, even along the Cascades. And warmer downstream of it, likely precipitation in the middle. That's the playbook that we're now watching for Christmas week. Again, still kind of 9 to 15 days out. Can't put too much weight into this now, but it's definitely leaning that way. So rooting for a cold Christmas in the east as maybe this isn't your favorite forecast. Eric's been showing this graphic quite a bit here as we've gone through December. This is looking at where those troughs and the ridges are over the North America. We're actually looking across the whole length of the globe here through the mid-latitudes. And of course, we've been kind of tracking. Where's that trough going to be? Is it going to set up in the west here like the models have suggested? This is the ECMWF AIFS ensemble, and it also has that support for troughing over the west like we just discussed. But again, my eye's more drawn to that ridging over the Aleutians. Look at how it's already settled in. We just looked at that here today. It caught my eye in the jet stream here this morning. But look at how persistent. It's just parked here over the Pacific. And if it's going to just stay here, that trough's going to stay downstream of it. It will at times cut across like a lot of these troughs often do. You can see that just in the forecast, which is why I said if that trough sets up here by the 24th or the 23rd, I would expect we're going to see one of those shortwaves cut across the country, bringing our next kind of interesting weather pattern, at least for 2 or 3 days for the central part of the country. But if that ridge stays here, that trough will return back to the west and bring something of a pattern change into January, which is why I'm like pretty skeptical of long-range January forecasts at this time for a number of reasons, that being maybe the chief one. But we're starting to lose an MJO signal. If we look at the extended weeklies, MJO diving into null space, maybe coming back out into 8, but we're not seeing any clear transition out into like 5 or 6 like I suggested maybe a week or two ago. It's just kind of not looking like a better signal to go off of. And so as long as that Pacific Ridge is going to stick around in the forecast, this pattern change I think could dominate the long-term forecast for a bit here. It's another reason I'm not looking too closely at the weeklies here. They've gone over a little wetter for California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado as a result of that low kind of tracking further south, but still looking pretty La Nina-y right now in the forecast, and that they're drier south, those areas that we talked about being more concerned about, wetter across the Ohio Valley and up into Canada, the upper Midwest as well. But again, I'm not putting too much weight into these January forecasts at the moment. I say that, I'm going to show you another one. This is from the NMME, and they have less precipitation chances for California and the Southeast. But this kind of looks like a copy and paste from the month before. And it's just that simple La Nina pattern. But we just looked, at least to end the month of December, this is kind of flipping around. So again, just another reason I'm not looking too closely at this. The NMME, I'm showing you the NMME because it just updated yesterday. I think Eric talked about it as well. This is their March, April, and May forecast. Eric showed you yesterday, I think, the April, May, and June one. I showed this one because kind of curiously, it's gone over dry here in the Central Plains just barely. I mean, you're talking minus 0.1 in terms of precipitation rates. So I don't want to put too much weight into this. It's not like it's one of these darker contours maybe worth discussing. But if you remember yesterday or on Tuesday, I showed you that analog for these similar La Nina years that strengthened into El Nino years. And they also had kind of a drier area here in spring, not in summer, not in the heart of the growing season, but in spring. So the fact that the NMME went over just a bit drier here caught my eye. We'll see where this goes as kind of the next seasonal runs update in January. But just kind of an area, given those analogs popped up a dry signal in spring here, I'm going to keep a little bit closer eye on. And, not the best news for California here as they go over wetter in December. I'm not confident that pattern is going to stick around. But like I said, in the long range, I think things are pretty mixed right now. And then in spring, if this area stays dry, as they are now, we're going to have some, increased concern for drought in that corridor next year. Again, early to talk about that, but it is what we're seeing in the long-range models. To wrap up here, I'll finish with this chart. This is looking at those sea surface temperatures we do all the time. It's instead of looking at just absolute deviation from their mean, this is looking at how the temperatures deviate from the global mean at this time. So it tells you less about history and more just about how they compare to one another across different geographies across the world. And the reason I'm showing that is because this La Nina stands out a lot better on this chart. So the water temperatures here are still very cold relative to the rest of the world currently. And so still kind of in the grips of this weak La Nina right now. We've been talking about it weakening. It has been weakening. We've been talking about its transition into El Nino, but it's worth mentioning that we're still very much in a La Nina. And I think the grips of the pattern, especially with this current flow regime we're seeing now, is the result of it. And while we're seeing something of a little bit of a change with that Pacific Ridge in the long range, a lot of those seasonal models, the NMME for January, the NMME for spring, etc., are going to keep flipping back to this La Nina if it sticks around, or at least its influence. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. A little bit of a negative Indian Ocean dipole there as it was kind of off its record highs earlier this year. But keeping track of all that, Eric will talk with you tomorrow on Friday. And if you made it to the end of the video today, thanks for watching.